So after the finale of Scream Season 2, we're left with a lot more questions than answers. Questions that can hopefully be answered by a Scream Season 3? Either way, the story isn't over yet, because this October, the series is going to return with a 2-part Halloween special. So let's try to wrap everything up that we know about this season so far, and try to predict what's in store for that Halloween special. So in a shocking turn of events, Kieran was revealed as the killer. Now apparently I was wrong in that he didn't actually have feelings for Emma. He made that pretty clear with the way that he stone cold rejected her.
You just told me you love me.
I did. Not now.
Oh, okay.
Turn down for weed.
He just wanted to avenge the death of his Piper, which is why he also went after Audrey this season. But he didn't really fill in that many blanks though. There's still a lot that we don't know about his motives. I will say though that the reveal here was pretty awesome and very reminiscent of Scream 2. And that's one of the things that this series has always done well, is the throwbacks and homages to the movies. In fact, I think this series has been a pretty good example of a reboot done the right way. You look at how much this series has borrowed from the movies, yet still remained original in its own way. You had characters that were all inspired by the ones from the original Scream. A Sydney, a Randy, a Billy, a Gail, a Tatum, a Stu. But eventually, they all grew to become their own characters. There was also a lot of storylines that were borrowed from the movies and expanded upon on this show, such as the mother with a dark past that inspired all the murders, the abandoned half-sibling who comes back for revenge, the suspicious boyfriend who starts as a red herring but ends up being the killer after all. And there was enough scenes thrown in here that reminded you of the movies without blatantly ripping them off, such as the opening scenes from both seasons being very reminiscent of the opening scenes from the first 2 movies. You had a tease of Tatum's garage scene, a tease of Randy's death scene, a reversed version of the Scream 2 killer reveal. Almost everything about this show is both true to the original and original in its own right. Take notes, Hollywood. This is how you make a good reboot. So I just wanted to give the series credit for that. However, they did end up breaking one tradition though, and that was, this is the very first Scream series in which someone wasn't killed in the opening scene, and it's the first time that they also let the killer survive. And after the performance that Kieran gave during his reveal speech, I think it's a great idea to keep his character around a little longer. Plus, it's an interesting dynamic that I don't think we've ever had in a whodunit before, to have a killer survive and still be able to interact with the other characters in kind of a Hannibal Lecter type of way. That could really add a lot to future seasons of the show. So we know that Kieran was the killer, but we still don't know who his accomplice is. Now Kieran had to have had an accomplice, especially after this episode where Audrey was kidnapped and moved to the orphanage. Kieran couldn't have done that on his own. For one, because he wouldn't have had the time to both kidnap Audrey and stab Brooke at the same time. And for 2, he left to the hospital with Brooke and the cops and the ambulance, so he couldn't have had time to drive Audrey to the orphanage on his own and tie her up and do all that other stuff. So he has to have an accomplice. Now the question is that accomplice the one that caught him from prison? Now this is where things get really interesting, because either it was his accomplice, which would probably be really stupid when you think about it, since the cops monitor the call, so why would his accomplice call him from jail using the killer's voice and admitting that he is the killer right then and there? I mean, but that's just movie logic, so whatever. So it's either his accomplice who's looking to break him out of prison, or this could be an entirely unrelated killer, in which case we could be in for an epic showdown. So let's try to fill in the rest of the blanks to figure out who this killer could possibly be. Now all the clues in this episode would lead us to believe that this is Brandon James speaking, which might actually make sense, Maybe he really was the killer after all, and he resents Emma's mom for selling him out. So he came back to Lakewood, found his daughter Piper, and he's been the mastermind behind this entire revenge plot. That would make a lot of sense. But I still stand by my theory that Emma's dad was the original killer that framed Brandon James. So I think this could go either way. He could either be the mastermind behind Piper and Kieran's plans, or he could just have a completely different motive altogether. So if this is a different person and this is Kieran's accomplice trying to break him out of prison, then I think the only person who that could actually be when you actually put everything together is Stavo. And this is interesting because all the clues that point to him being the killer were pretty much thrown in your faces throughout the series, which is pretty smart on their behalf. The more they keep exposing him as the killer and leaving all these clues to connect him to the killings, the more we reject the idea of him actually being the killer, because they wouldn't make it that obvious, would they, right? Unfortunately, though, they pretty much killed all of the other characters who could have been the suspects, so he's pretty much the only one that makes any sense when you go through the process of elimination. That's why it's sometimes better to keep a lot of characters alive. That way it's a lot harder to narrow down the suspects. But the big thing I noticed throughout this season is that the killer has obviously had something against Brooke. I mean, poor Brooke was probably the biggest victim of this season. First, her boyfriend was killed, then his bloody remains were dumped right in front of her, then her ex-boyfriend was killed, then she was supposed to walk in and find their dead bodies at the high school, then her dad gets killed, then she gets stabbed. I mean, what kind of a relentless, heartless bastard would torture my Brooke like that? Probably the same heartless bastard that's been trying to get in her pants at whatever cost. So that's my prediction for who Kieran's accomplice is going to be revealed. Now, as for other hopes that I have for this series, besides that it gets picked up for a season 3, we need to find out more about Audrey's involvement with Piper. I really hope they don't just leave it at, well, she sent her some angry letters, but that's about it. There has to be a lot more to that. And that also leads into my next hope. I want there to be an episode that takes us back through the entire series from the killer's perspective. This was an idea that I pitched in my review of the Scream movies, link in the description if you haven't watched it. Basically, I want there to be an episode that shows us how everything happened, how Piper plotted everything, watching how Kieran avoids being suspected, seeing how much Audrey was really involved, taking us back through each and every kill to distinguish who was under the mask every time. I want there to be a behind the killings episode that will not only tie together all the loose ends, but give us some insight into how the killers operate. It's something that we've never really seen done in a whodunit, and I think if there's any series that can do it right, it is Scream.